I've been training for the best striker in the world. I've been going to Holland all my life, my last 10 years, so I've been training for the best stand-up fighter, so I don't care about his stand-up. I'll be ready in the ring, I'm gonna go for a knockout. I always step in the ring to knock somebody out, so.
At one time, the name of Pedro Rizzo brought real horror to the fighters of the old school, an elite striker with the worst low kicks in his arsenal, who after the triumph of his mentor Marco Ruas at UFC 7 also went into MMA and was at the top for quite a long time. And today, we'll remember the whole path of Pedro and the most significant fights in his career. It all started according to the standard Brazilian system, namely with the Vale Tudo tournaments, where Pedro went in 1996, and at that time he was only 23. His first opponent was the Canadian Eric LaBelle, who gave Pedro a good standing fight, and he was especially good in the tie clinch. But when the Brazilian brought him down, the fight was over. Brutal finishing moves on the ground is the first finish for young Pedro. After a bright debut, Rizzo signed up for the World Vale Tudo Championship, the tournament of 8, and at the first stage he got an American karateka with a funny nickname Nicolaus.
Nico Hill in purple, going for the quick strike.
Instant rapprochement and Pedro takes this bully down, who being below twitches his limbs in a panic and also tries to put his fingers into the mouth or eyes of the Brazilian out of fear. But as soon as Pedro begins to beat him as a big boy, Nicolaus decides not to tempt fate and taps in surrender. The first opponent was eliminated without any problems, and at the second stage Rizzo goes to Michael Tilroy, a Belgian representing Muay Thai. Pedro didn't work with Michael in a standing position, but instantly went to the body, took the opponent down and ended the fight by Americana at the 18th second. Very fast and most importantly energy-saving victory before the final. In total, for 2 fights, Pedro spent only 2 minutes in the ring. In the final, he fought against the representative of the Kent Shamrocks team, Vernon White, and unlike previous fighters, he could boast of a fairly rich combat experience and a record of 10-17. Actually, Vernon spent most of his fights in Pancrase, an organization with severe restrictions in striking, unlike from Vale Tudo, where almost everything was allowed. And here is the same low kick from Pedro, who launched his bazooka only in this battle. White fought back with tips, trying to keep his distance or clinching to avoid these low kicks. He really didn't like these feelings.
White coming into the
After the 7th minute, Pedro drops White and ends the fight with 1 kick to the back of the head. That's how the young Rizzo broke into the world of blood and violence, won 3 victories in a night and became the champion of the tournament of 8 in Vale Tudo. At the same time, for the mid-90s he was a real discovery, as he was dangerous both in a stance and on the canvas, and at that time all-rounders could be counted on the fingers of one hand.
Hello, I'm Richard Red Herd, champion of World Vale Tudo 1. I'm here to fight Pedro Rizzo, champion of World Vale Tudo 2. I'm here to prove that I am the best fighter here.
2 months after his championship, Pedro agreed for a super fight with another champion of the very first Vale Tudo tournament. It was the freestyle and sambo wrestler Richard Herd, nicknamed Red, who also had no defeats and an overall record of 5-0, all of which were by submission.
Oh, strong punches.
An instant exchange and the Red tries to take Pedro down, but gets caught in a corner where the Brazilian bombs him with his knees. Richard also tries to respond, but the damage in these blows is too much of a difference. Pedro smashes Rich in a stance, and when the fight goes to canvas, he continues to smash the Red and fill the ring with his blood. Richard knits, but this stops Pedro only for a while the Red manages to delay the inevitable, but doesn't prevent it. Pedro distracts Rich with a headbutt to the face and instantly passes the guard. It was all over and the Red didn't dispute it. He taps as a sign of surrender, and at the 14th minute of the fight, Pedro celebrates a beautiful and laborious victory. This is how young Pedro Rizzo started furiously and confidently in fights without rules, for whom the next step was a transfer to UFC, and at that moment he already had 5-0 and everything was ahead of time. In October 1998, UFC came to Brazil and Pedro was among the participants. His opponent was cage star Tank Abbott, who by that time had already managed to fight for the UFC belt and close up this defeat with 2 victories.
Are you ready? Let's get it on!
Tank, in his style, decided to chop to death and almost immediately gets the oncoming one from Pedro. But even with this shot, Rizzo didn't calm the restless Abbott, who having got up to his feet again stepped forward. Actually, his functionality was not designed for such a long battle, which lasted for about a minute and the Tank noticeably sank. And what does Rizzo do with tired opponents? That's right, he disassembles them with low kicks, slowing down the already slow Abbott. At the 3rd minute, Tank takes Pedro to the canvas where he controls and throws punches, but soon the referee raises the fighters to their feet and it sounds like a sentence. A very bright debut for Pedro, who beautifully destroyed the UFC star and immediately flew onto the top of his weight. At the UFC 18 tournament, Pedro went on Mark Coleman, who after a brilliant start of his career had already lost twice in a row, while Pete Williams made it with the most brutal head kick, who then got into the UFC Hall of Fame. So the hammer was no longer so dangerous and the fighters knew how to act against him, thanks to Morris Smith, who drew a precise template. Pedro worked according to the same scheme, endured the onslaught at the beginning and took the ending in a stance. Although he won this fight by split decision, the fight turned out to be very close and not everyone agrees with such a final verdict. After Mark, there was a sparkling fight with Trey Teligman, whose story can be told to people suffering from depression and despair. As a child, he lost part of the pectoral muscle and his right lung, but he still achieved his goal and fought with the best fighters on unequal terms, and even at one time was able to beat Igor Vovchanchyn. In this fight, Trey wasn't afraid to brawl with Pedro, although even many full-fledged fighters wouldn't have done this for no reason, and in this swing he actually could lay down the Brazilian. But Pedro was better that evening and he knocked out Teligman at the end of the 1st round. Trey's example was followed by Tsuyoshi Kasaka, whom Pedro finished in Japan, after which he received his first title shot, but his dreams of a championship were dashed in a bout with Kevin Randleman. The monster took the fight by decision of the judges and remained the champion, and Pedro, after the first defeat in his career, went on Dan 7.
You quit. Oh, powerful. And Dan's really concerned about again. And he goes down.
For the Beast, these low kicks were too harsh. Pedro finished Dan in a minute and a half and signed up for a fight with Josh Barnett, who was undefeated with 10 pro wins and great prospects to fight for the belts in the future. Super Mario gives the go-ahead and the fighters begin. In this fight, Josh looked great in the stance. He wasn't afraid to take this dangerous game against a puncher like Pedro, so a couple of missed low kicks and jabs were must-haves in this entertainment program. After 7 years, it's time for retribution. Josh and Pedro's rematch took place in the Affliction. This tournament was called Banned. It brought together the best fighters in the world who were not associated with UFC. Andrei Arlovsky knocked out Ben Rothwell, Fedor took out Tim Sylvia in 16 seconds, and the fight between Rizzo and Barnett wasn't less spectacular than the previous two. Apparently, Josh's pride really wanted blood and revenge, and at the same time, it wanted to take revenge in a stance. No takedowns, just punches, and that night Josh set out to beat the most dangerous puncher by his rules. Barnett used dives and slips to great effect, making him feel like a big white Pernell Whitaker, and he punched heavy front kicks and roundhouse kicks, preparing a trap for Pedro. At the beginning of the second round, Josh brought his left to Pedro's chin, which knocked the puncher off his feet and sent the Brazilian to the same sanatorium that Barnett himself had visited after their first fight. But here it's worth saying that by that time Pedro was far from being at his peak, and Barnett was in a good pace. After that first knockout of George, Pedro got a title shot, and Randy Couture became his opponent. He went for the first belt defense, which he won for the second time, but before this fight he unsuccessfully traveled to Japan and lost to Valentine Overeem.
You ready? Let's get it on!
Here we go. Heavyweight title fight. Kevin Randleman, and he went down to defeat that night. Ironically, it was Randleman recently defeated. In 5-minute rounds scheduled here in the... There's the knee. Nice. There's the knee.
That knee, especially when you're coming forward, really take it.
Jam. And he finishes another one. Combinations on Rizzo. Rizzo trying to
also doing damage.
Big time damage, guys. Big time damage.
Oh!
And he finishes.
Third grade fans, it's a terrific.
Oh, what a leg.
Power
And he
kick.
got him good. Powers at age 18 when he first suffered defeat.
That's
But to their totally.
sort of forward movement.
Oh!
There's the now. We've seen this a couple times tonight where first round's totally opposite of the second.
And 35 seconds remaining.
Oh, the jab.
Rocketing. Just missed with that one. Combinations
There, Rizzo knew what to do. There,
Rizzo. Down goes Couture. 5 seconds in the round. McCarthy's right there.
backside towards the middle of the octagon.
Good upper up round number 3. And there's the shoot.
Nice.
Harbar carrying him down all the way too, but that's the kind of thing that you do so well.
On down to defeat for the first time in
He's going to get him.
UFC
He's
career.
down.
Short and choppy. and if he
Carlos Newton and Rizzo trying to become the new champ and high energy.
Nice left hook.
Couture still trying to close in.
nice. So Legs is a guy that moves forward.
Nice, pushing the head down.
It's just this is the opportunity. Now, these 3 minutes are going to tell who wins the
This right here with Rizzo trying. Couture. Third to this final minute of played by these fighters here tonight. Should have ended in round 1.
In the very ending, Pedro crossed the champion a little, and I don't even know if such a fall is considered a knockdown or Randy fell from fatigue. But Pedro confidently took the ending and threw up his hands, believing that he had won the fight.
The winner, and still UFC heavyweight.
The judges were of a different opinion and gave the victory to Couture unanimously, who even himself seemed to be surprised. Second round for Pedro 10-8, first, third and fourth for Couture 10-9, and if the fifth is for Pedro 10-9, then we have a draw. And if there was a knockdown, then 10-8 and Rizzo wins. But this is only my analytics, and maybe I didn't take something into account, but as for me, Pedro was robbed that evening. This fight became the fight of the year in 2001, and because of such a close and controversial decision, an immediate rematch was set. But this time Pedro couldn't give Couture a competitive fight. Randy took the victory with the help of the ground and pound and didn't bring the fight to a decision of the judges. He scored Pedro into the canvas in the third round and retained his championship belt. Rizzo was so upset that he didn't even wait for the announcement of the winner and left the cage. These two fights broke the Brazilian, and after this confrontation he already began to give up a little. But he didn't become a less dangerous knockout because of this, and he could knock out an opponent in any condition. With such a beautiful double, he slashed Arlovski and closed the defeat from Randy. And after 2 more losses and 2 wins, the Brazilian needed a new challenge, and he found it in Japan. Pedro went to Pride.
And look at this, what we're seeing in the middle of the ring.
Yeah, no more Mr. Nice Guy, and he starts off right away at the...
His first opponent in the Pride was Sergey Kharitonov, with whom they fired up the audience with cool stare down, and the guys didn't let us down in the fight either. Sergey starts well with jabs and counterattacks Rizzo's jab, after which he catches the Brazilian's leg and takes him down to the ground. The beginning is completely for Sergey, whose boxing was simply out of reach for Pedro. He missed everything that flew in his direction and looked absolutely helpless in this fight. So it was just a crushing victory for Kharitonov, who took the Brazilian to a boxing school and finished the fight in 2 minutes. Rizzo's adventures in Japan didn't end there, and faith in himself after defeat didn't go anywhere. In his second fight in Pride, the Brazilian fought with Roman Zensov, and he entered this fight for an early victory.
Fighting in Holland, won everything.
Roman only needed one hit to end the fight. Signature left hook to the head of the Brazilian and the light went out. So in his second fight, Pedro suffered an even more severe defeat than from Kharitonov. Rizzo didn't fight anymore in Pride. He started to travel around the world and play in minor leagues, where he also had defeats and victories.
Sails past the nose of Rizzo. Oh. Rizzo shoots, takes him down, but look who's on top. And look at Rizzo, flies him, it's all over.
He beat big name fighters like Monson, Goodrich and Ken Shamrock, but by then they were all short-term pilots who fought mostly for money than sport ambitions. He also lost to Fedor in M1, but this victory of the Emperor shouldn't be exaggerated, since it was the very sunset of the once dangerous puncher Pedro Rizzo. The Brazilian finished his career with a record of 12-11 and can be considered one of the most unsuccessful challengers in the history of UFC. He fought 3 times for the championship belt and lost all 3 of them. And there is an opinion that the decision of the judges for the first fight with Couture was a turning point from which the Brazilian never recovered and lost motivation. If you liked my video and want to help to promote it, then don't leave without a like and a comment. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel and press the bell to stay in touch and not to miss new reviews.